I'm here today just in my capacity as a member of the Committee for the Office of the First and Deputy First Minister, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to open today's seminar. It's a personal area of interest to me, given that I'm a party spokesperson on children and young people issues, and it's a topic of particular interest to the Committee, given that children and young people's issues is a central strand of our work. It's part of the Committee's role to track the progress that is being made on implementing the UN Convention here in the North, as well as the progress that is being made in achieving the goals of our children and young people's strategy. The reports that are written must tell us about children's well-being and enjoyment, the enjoyment of their rights or not, and it's clear then that the indicators that are used to that should be appropriate and accurate. They should be able to measure and record changes, help to identify trends and predict what might happen in the future. This autumn, the North is going to be reporting again to the Convention's monitoring body on the progress that is being made in implementing the Convention here, and it's important that our report meets the recommended standards for reporting on that progress. Marina and her colleagues have been doing new and important research on developing indicators that are founded on the key principles of the UNCRC. The Child's Right Indicator Framework is still a work in progress, but hopefully the presentation today is going to give us some idea of why it's so important and what we'll be able to achieve. And before I finish off, I just want to give my apologies in advance. I'm going to have to slip out early, so something came up, but I'll not keep you any longer, and I'll hand you over now to Marina. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So our presentation today is based on an ongoing research project commissioned by the OFMDFM, and it's still very much a work in progress. So what we'll do today is talk more about the background in terms of UNCRC and developing children's rights indicators, and a bit about the process we're going through to develop the Child Rights Indicators Framework. But we'll not be able to present the actual indicator framework today because we're going through a consultation exercise, which I'll talk a wee bit about later. But after Easter we'll be much further along, and hopefully then we'll be able to come back and tell you a bit more about it. But it's good to sort of catch up at this stage just in terms of this important work around the UNCRC. So the OFMDFM funded research project aims to develop a set of strategic child rights indicators related to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, by further developing existing work in this area and drawing upon international standards and good practice, including the general comments and concluding observations of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And it aims to provide a child rights indicators framework for data analysis required, as Megan rightly said, to inform the state report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which could also potentially be used to inform the development and review of future strategy and policy in relation to children and young people in Northern Ireland, as well as identifying gaps in data which could align future research needs and commissioning to the UNCRC. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child provides a framework for governments to monitor and realise the rights of children and young people, and its monitoring body, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, is the universal safeguarding system for children's rights. And state parties are required to report every 5 years, and the next reporting period is January 2014, but that's a whole UK-wide report, and so each jurisdiction feeds into that. So the Northern Ireland data needs to be ready by early autumn this year. The reporting guidelines issued by the committee require state parties to present in the reports information regarding the implementation of the provisions of the Convention, with particular reference to previous committee recommendations or concluding observations as well. So that needs to be taken into account in terms of tracking progress. Data is required for the state report, which illustrates the progress being made in implementing children's rights for all children in Northern Ireland. So the UNCRC provides a framework for governments to monitor and realise the rights of children and young people through 42 substantive articles. And the reporting guidelines require data to be organised in the report by clusters of articles, and take account, as I said earlier, of the general comments of previous committees. And when you start to think about developing articles, some indicators may serve to monitor more than one article. For example, infant mortality rates may monitor the right to survival, but also say something about the right to health as well. whereas other rights are so big that it needs several articles. For example, the right to education, where you need to cover access to education, participation in that education, and outcomes of education. So as you can see, it's quite a complex task to cover the whole range of clusters and articles within it, but also some quite complex, quite big articles. And the framework needs to be underpinned by the principles of the UNCRC Convention, which has important messages for data collection and analysis. The principle of non-discrimination identifies the need to disaggregate data to ensure that no group of children are treated unfairly or discriminated against. This may mean ensuring that there is adequate data and analysis about their circumstances and experiences. The principle of best interests places an obligation on legislative and policy makers to give primary consideration to whether a decision will have an impact on children's lives, to assess what that impact will be, and to alleviate children's interests in the final decision. And that takes you into some of the child rights impact assessments that you'll have seen carried out by a range of organisations, but also within government themselves. Data also needs to include the children's voice and how children feel decisions are impacting on their lives. And the principle of survival and development in Article 4 means the maximum use of resources need to be available to meet that requirement. So there's a range of underlying principles that cut right across all the clusters that we need to take account of as well. And Una later on will talk a bit more about the clusters and how they fit in the framework. So guidance from the Committee on the Rights of the Child states that the child rights indicators should include baseline information, which provides data for a certain year or period against which all future data can be measured to show improvements or deteriorations. A system of indicators which can provide integrated information rather than a list of disparate information. Disaggregated data that can show which groups or groups of children have rights violated or not achieved. An integrated age range through which information about children can be compared between different agencies to adopt a holistic approach and see how children are faring over all of their childhood. And have children as a unit of observation which provides direct information about children and their lives rather than about adults or institutions or whole families. Okay. So the purpose, just to summarise, of indicators is to describe the condition of children's lives, to enable comparisons, to monitor, to inform policy making, to inform service planning, development and delivery, to reinforce accountability, to evaluate and to lobby for change, to allow lobbying for change as well. And the UNCRC and its committee monitors the implementation of children's rights from state parties, and they produce a number of general comments. In general comment number 5 on the implementation of the Convention, the committee states that collection of sufficient and reliable data on children, disaggregated to enable identification of discrimination and or disparities in the realisation of rights, is an essential part of implementation. It is essential not merely to establish effective systems for data collection, but to ensure that the data collected are evaluated and used to assess progress in implementation. To achieve this, the UN Committee has recommended that the state party establish a nationwide system whereby disaggregated data is collected on all persons under 18 years for all areas covered by the Convention, including the most vulnerable groups, and that this data are used to assess progress and design policies to implement the Convention. So key elements of the child rights indicator suggest that a focus is on the implementation of the Convention and monitoring the promotion and protection of children's rights, that it assess progress on the realisation of rights over time using the child as a unit of assessment, that it relates to all Convention rights, that it addresses and reflects the principles of the Convention, are dependent on disaggregated data to assess realisation of children's rights, particularly for those currently experiencing discrimination or inequality in the enjoyment of their rights, to recognise childhood as a life stage, including the whole period of childhood, are premised on both qualitative and quantitative data, incorporate both positive and negative aspects of children's lives, are participatory and include the views of children and experiences of children and young people to evaluate the extent to which children's rights are being realised, and that they should help empower right holders to claim their rights. So what's the constraints and challenges of developing a child rights framework? Well, taking the size of UNCRC and the number of clusters and the number of articles, it's about being realistic in what we can achieve. There's a manageability issue in terms of the amount of data that can be created. And we need to start with the available data that's already in existence. There's a wealth of data out there, and part of this exercise reviews that. So we need to look at existing data and its adequacy, the limitations of that data to monitor children's rights and what gaps there are in the data, and to see how we can pull that together to create a baseline that we can monitor progress in realising rights over time. And one of the other constraints within Northern Ireland is that we're reported then within the UK State Report. So we produce a Northern Ireland report which is then amalgamated with other jurisdictions into the UK State Report, and there's a certain amount of information lost there. So one of the things that OFM, DFM are discussing are ways to sort of counteract that as well, that we can take forward our system of monitoring children's rights and maintain that. So before I hand over to Una to talk about the actual practical side of the project and what we've been doing to date, just to say that this work didn't start from scratch. There had been a number of developmental pieces of work carried out by the Children's Law Centre and Save the Children, producing a theoretical framework for children's rights indicators. And what we've been doing is trying to take a pragmatic approach of taking that work forward to develop a set of indicators that can be used in monitoring over time. And OFM, DFM, commissioning this research, have done so to drive forward the development of children's rights indicators and provide a rights-based reporting framework for monitoring the progress for children in Northern Ireland, but also to feed into the children and young people's strategy and to feed into research strategy around children and young people as well in the future. So at this stage I'll hand over to Una.
As a very quick recap, as Marina has said, the development of the indicators framework was going to be premised on the 42 articles of the UNCRC, incorporating the key principles, organised by thematic clusters with reference to the general comments and concluding observations, and underpinned by the 4 general principles which Marina has already expanded on. Just as a further point of information, the indicators then are organised by thematic clusters, and the clusters used to group together the articles of the CRC are the general measures of implementation, the general principles, civil rights and freedoms, family, environment and alternative care, health and welfare, education, leisure and culture, and special protection measures. And it's a nice, neat system, if you like, because it allows you to group together some of the common articles as well as also group together some of the cross-cutting ones. So it just enables them to be organised in a more structured and a more organised way. In terms of the actual process itself then, the process began initially with consultation with key stakeholders within the children's sector, and that was through a series of reference group meetings which have both been already started and they will be going on continuing throughout the process. And also the point we're at the minute through a series of cluster group meetings, and those cluster group meetings are being held with the relevant departments at the moment, and then will also be held further down the line again with key stakeholders from the children's sector who have a particular interest or a particular expertise in some of the in some of the particular clusters. The process itself really comprised 2 fairly systematic stages. The first stage was an initial scoping and mapping exercise to highlight the existing high-level indicators that are currently in existence, and then the second stage involved an analysis and review of the indicators with reference to the data that was available. And as Marina has already said, part of that review of the existing data, what that showed, and I mean, I think it's important that we flag this up, it was quite, and positively, was that there is such a wealth of very, very rich data already available for analysis. That data is both quantitative and qualitative, and it is also available from a range of sources. So, for example, you have departmental surveys, you have official statistics, you have organisational surveys, and you have qualitative data and research studies, some of which includes representation from children and young people themselves. So, to help us basically organise and collate and record the process of the data that was there, it was collated on a series of spreadsheets, and reflecting the previous slide, the data was mapped onto the relevant cluster and the relevant articles of the CRC that it applied to, and it was also mapped against the current strategic indicators of the Children and Young People's 10-year strategy from OFM-DFM, and also the indicators that have been developed by the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership. And each spreadsheet contained very specific information in relation to the data. So that included, for example, the source of the data, what kind of indicator it was, the nature of it, whether it was an outcomes indicator or whether it was a structural indicator, what the baseline measurement of it had been, what level of disaggregation there was it quite comprehensively disaggregated, or was it just disaggregated over a couple of groups or a couple of areas, and then also it aligned against the particular article of the CRC that it applied to. Once we had all that data collated and set down onto the spreadsheet, we moved on into into stage 2 then, which was an analysis of everything that we had collated. And this process then became a little bit more focused, in the sense that we began to examine the data and identify what gaps appeared to be there to us, to suggest how the gaps might be filled using the existing data that I've already said is available, to identify how far the data is disaggregated so that it would be possible to see what differences might exist in the circumstances or the experiences of children belonging to different groups. So, for example, children maybe from an ethnic minority background, disabled children, gender, any range of disaggregated data. What we also wanted to do too, which we're keen to include, was to identify the extent to which the qualitative data provided evidence of the experience and views of children themselves for each of the clusters, because, as Marina pointed out, one of the key principles is that the voice of children and young people is present in any of the reporting mechanisms to the CRC, and it was one of the areas that was maybe more lightly populated, if you like, within the data. So we wanted to sort of interrogate some of the qualitative research to see to what extent the voice of children and young people had been included, and that was also represented on the spreadsheets. And then also identify any key issues, if any, for which there wasn't any data currently available, or for which there was very limited data, and on the basis of that suggest perhaps either an alternative or an additional indicator that could effectively capture the gap that was there. So that's where we're at the moment in terms of the data collection. As Marina said at the outset, we're working collaboratively with OFM-DFM on this exercise, and the next stage of the work with OFM-DFM and with the other key stakeholders is to basically go through a review and a refinement process in relation to the spreadsheets of data that we already have. First of all, to clarify the availability of data for some indicators, because there may be an instance where we weren't able to source a particular piece of data, but the departments have been able to confirm it is available and it can be sourced from wherever. So that's been a very useful and a very helpful exercise. Through these cluster group meetings with the departments and with the children's sector, it's to work towards agreement on a final strategic set of indicators across each of the cluster groups, which will provide a baseline for monitoring children's rights over time. It's also to continue to further develop the framework, which will be used in the reporting to the CRC at this point in time, but also to see it very much as a living document, so that we will also continue to identify gaps in the data that could be addressed over the next reporting period, so that, you know, we will get better at it again the next time round. And then to populate the data for the framework for Northern Ireland's input into the UK State Report in the autumn. So once the final framework is agreed, and given the cluster group meetings that we will have had, it's been able to put the best set of data into Northern Ireland's report. And then on the basis of the final indicator framework, OFM, DFM will use this in driving forward children and young people's policy in the future. Thank you.